Hey guys, welcome to another huge episode of Triggered. I hope you're all having a great start to the week. Big show for you today. Today we're sitting down with a first-time guest, Marshall Billingsley. In the first Trump term, he was the guy in charge of hunting terrorist financing all over the world. He ran the Office of Terrorist Financing at the Treasury Department. And we are getting into all of that today. We're talking about the cartels, the Chinese money laundering networks that are literally bankrolling the fentanyl crisis, Iran's terror finance machine, the Monroe Doctrine, and what comes next. So make sure you guys are liking, sharing, subscribing so you never miss one of these major episodes. If you do miss the show here on Rumble, make sure to head over to Apple, to Spotify, and catch it there. If your friends get their podcast that way, make sure they know they can get it there as well. For all of the top headlines that we cover on the show, go over to my news app, MXM News, like minute by minute, MXM, where you can get the mainstream news without the mainstream bias. And of course, don't forget about our brave sponsors for having the guts to support this program. Support those who share your values, guys. And guys, I want to tell you about a new way to combat censorship online with Rumble Wallet. Look, Rumble has never wavered in its support of free speech. And now, they've introduced something that will give us protection from the big banks shutting us off. So that's why they launched the Rumble Wallet, a wallet that no one can cancel, and a wallet that supporters can use to instantly tip creators without any middlemen taking any cuts. With Rumble Wallet, you control your money. Not a bank, not a government, not a tech company, not even Rumble can touch it. It's yours, and it's only yours. You can even buy and save digital assets all in one place. So download the Rumble Wallet today, open an account, and step away from the big banks for good. Just go to wallet.rumble.com or search Rumble Wallet in the App Store. Again, that's rumble.wallet.com. Check it out. First, check out all the latest predictions on Polymarket. So if you follow politics, you know everyone's got an opinion. But on Polymarket, you actually get real odds on what's likely to happen. Polymarket is a prediction market where people trade on real events, elections, debates, policy moves, and it doesn't stop at politics. There are markets on the economies, tech, sports, pop culture, and so much more. It's all live, it's transparent, and it gives you a real-time indicator of what people really think is going to happen. So go give it a look at polymarket.com, check it out, and let me know what you think. Joining me now is former Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department for Terrorist Financing, Marshall Billingsley. Marshall, thanks for joining the program. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So you ran the office at Treasury that tracks terrorist money, criminal finance, all over the world. Can you briefly, introduce yourself to the audience so they have an understanding of what we're talking about here, since this is a fairly relevant thing over all the news we've gotten over the last few months?
Sure. So after 9/11 and the results of the investigation, the commission investigation into the breakdown, the intelligence failures to see all of the al-Qaeda money moving into the country, Congress enacted a law which created, among many other things, my office, which I held under President Trump in the first administration, which is the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. The purpose of that office is to both set the anti-money laundering policies for the United States government, but it's also the operational sort of tip of the spear for the Treasury in terms of working with foreign governments to disrupt terrorist financing and proliferation financing at the source. There are other parts of the Treasury, such as the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which work in the same organization, that are responsible for sanctions. We have FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is our financial intelligence unit that monitors suspicious activity reporting by the banks. And then we have an intelligence shop. So I worked hand in glove with those other organizations underneath the undersecretary. And of course, Venezuela was a main focus of ours in the first administration, as was Iran.
So, I mean, obviously regarding Venezuela and really a lot of Latin America with the narco trafficking going on. I mean, this administration obviously designated the Sinaloa cartel, CJNG, the Cartel de las Soles, and others as foreign terrorist organizations. Record numbers of sanctions have been done in a single year. And we're using some of these same tools against Hezbollah and the IRGC, and I'm sure, Boko Haram, and amongst others. For people watching at home, why do these designations really matter? Sometimes, people say, oh, they're just calling them that, but they're not actually doing it. What can we do, to cartel money now that perhaps we couldn't do before they were actually designated as terrorist organizations?
Quite a bit. The decision, and it's long overdue, the decision to designate the cartels in Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations enables a number of things, but most importantly, it opens up the possibility for the United States to conduct covert action or direct action with special forces and SEALs against these organizations. So you add a kinetic option on the table, which goes along with the financial disruptions. So when you designate these organizations and you make clear who exactly within the organization is designated, you basically freeze them out of the international financial system. So it becomes very difficult for these people to get bank accounts, very difficult for them to get credit cards. You really complicate not only the financial structure of their organization, but their own personal finances too.
I mean, can they just simply, assign a straw man to that, and these people are, under penalty of death, that someone else can just do it? I mean, or are the numbers just so big that you can't just say, hey, we got 10 bank accounts, it doesn't matter? I mean, the volume of transaction, the size of the transactions, where those things are being done, just sort of signals to the Treasury that this is obviously a nefarious activity.
They do set up straw men all the time, and there are a number of jurisdictions, especially in Latin America. Here I would focus on Panama, for instance, that serve as home for shell companies that are created to both help evade U.S. sanctions and obfuscate ownership, whether it's ownership in real estate or in yachts or private planes or all the kinds of things that we see the narcos liking to spend their money on. But they also use these front companies for their business activities as well. So you are in a constant state of hunting these shell companies down, exposing them, disrupting them. They'll shut them down and they'll open new ones, sometimes in the same jurisdiction, sometimes within hours. But that doesn't mean that you give up trying. You continually pursue them to the ends of the earth.
So, obviously a lot of talk about Panama and places like that. I mean, there seems to be a lot more outreach as of now. You saw Shield of the Americas coming up, last week, working with a lot of these Latin American jurisdictions to combat, the narco trafficking. Panama, obviously, America seems to have a pretty good shot at, getting the canal and, at least control thereof. Is it just the way these systems are working, or is there government entanglement in some of these Latin American countries that are just allowing this to happen because they're happy to have the money flow through them and, they're punching their fees and whatever it may be?
100% government entanglement in many cases. You have major conflicts of interest. In Panama, you have members of the government who themselves ran or were significant partners in the very law firms that were establishing shell companies. So you get a fair amount of that. You also get drug money is just absolutely corrupting. And so the cocaine-related money coming out of both Colombia and Venezuela, you've got that plus heroin and obviously the methamphetamines and all of that coming out of Mexico. That all just gradually and sometimes very rapidly erodes the rule of law. It's just corrosive.
I mean, the one I think of the most in that one is obviously, Mexico. You saw, I think it was 33 of the 35 people who ran for president the last time around were essentially killed by the cartels. That tells me that, the other two that made it probably didn't get lucky. They just, have an understanding.
Right.
Can you even be in government on a high level in some of these countries right now and be against the cartels? Certainly in Mexico, it doesn't seem like it to me.
It's certainly a risky proposition, but there are, and I worked very closely with the Mexican government in the first Trump administration. We at the Treasury have and still have a really rock solid relationship with what they call Hacienda, which is their treasury, and really good people there trying to do the right thing. But when you hit those senior levels in the government, and if you're going after the cartels, you have put a bullseye on you and your family.
Yeah, I guess there's no real limits to what they'll will ultimately do. So with that sort of in mind, how much can Treasury, as long as they're able to operate in those places, how do you make that stopgap to really put on as much pain as possible, so make their lives as difficult as possible, prevent as much of the human trafficking and drug trafficking as possible. From the Treasury standpoint, obviously there's the kinetic options, and those hopefully I've been a believer, because I don't know, frankly, what's more of a clear and present, danger to the United States of America than fentanyl that kills 100,000 Americans every year. How do you do that to have the greatest efficacy in stopping, all of the nefarious activities that they're doing?
So some of it is reciprocal intelligence exchange. So you go down, you meet with, in my case, with the Internal Security Service and their Financial Intelligence Unit in Mexico, and with Hacienda, and you give them as much classified information as the U.S. government and the intelligence community is comfortable sharing. But ideally, it's enough that points them in the direction of whatever the bad activity is that you're trying to get them to disrupt. There are a number of other operational relationships that Treasury tried to facilitate unsuccessfully, frankly, with AMLO while he was in power in Mexico. I'll give you just two examples. One is, we really need the Mexicans to work with us on judicial wiretaps to enable law enforcement to gather the necessary information to mount prosecutions. And they really were not at all helpful on that. They also were not helpful in terms of doing bulk cash delivery by DEA and others. The relationship with DEA was pretty fractured, and under Biden, DEA fell apart under Biden. He destroyed that agency. Morale was
amongst others, yeah.
Yeah, right. And in particular, they just were not even being allowed to operate in Mexico. So I believe that this time around, President Trump has put quite a bit of pressure on Scheinbaum to play ball, and clearly they are. They've done they've done renditions for us of key individuals. They just killed a major narco leader a few days ago. So they are stepping up, but they're only stepping up because the pressure that the president is applying to them.
Yeah, so I guess a big component that I think of when I think of the Mexican drug cartels is obviously the link to China, and ultimately Chinese money laundering networks that are basically now the bank for the Mexican drug cartels. You investigated, these kinds of hidden financial structures for years. How does it work? And where do we hit it when you have that kind of cross-border collaboration in the narco world?
The Chinese money laundering aspect. So China plays in the fentanyl trade with the Mexicans in three different ways. The first is that they sell precursor chemicals. In fact, nowadays, because the Mexicans have gotten so sophisticated, they're selling precursors to the precursors to make the fentanyl, which makes it really hard to track, because these are everyday industrial use chemicals in a lot of cases. Yeah. The second thing the Chinese have done is they've provided the chemists to the cartels who have instructed them and trained them on how to actually make this weapon of mass destruction, which is what it is. And the third thing, which is incredibly difficult to crack, is they perform a third-party money laundering function. So here's how it works in the U.S. The fentanyl comes across the border, it gets sold, and whatever narco structure here, usually Mexicans that's making the sale, will collect up the dollars, the physical banknotes, and the Chinese will come in and get that from them periodically. And then they will do what they call smurfing, which is they'll bring that money into banks in small amounts below the suspicious activity reporting thresholds. And they'll move those into accounts, and they'll then sweep all that together into a couple of large accounts with lots, millions of dollars. But that's where the money sits. It sits in the bank. It doesn't anymore transit outside of the United States. It just stays there. Because what happens on the other end is the same third-party money laundering operation will approach people, high net worth people in China, who want to get their money out from communist China. because communist China has capital controls, right?
Of
So
course.
you can't move dollars out of the country very easily.
Oh boy.
And they will sell those people the US bank accounts in exchange for Chinese currency, for yuan. And so the high net worth person will put money in a bank account in yuan, and in exchange they get control through whoever they deputize here in the United States of the accounts here in the US. Then the cartel will use that money that's parked in China in the Chinese currency to buy the precursor chemicals and other stuff to send back to the cartel. That is one of the most elaborate and one of the hardest to break money laundering operations associated with the drug trade.
Yeah, I mean it's incredibly sophisticated. I mean that's no joke. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, one of the big things is a lot of obviously Chinese money that wants to get out of there. So, I mean, I guess some of these Chinese nationals, they're sort of unwitting participants in even this. They're just happy to get money out of China, so to speak, or are they sort of inextricably linked to the cartels and or the CCP, whoever's doing this over in China?
They're breaking Chinese law for sure, right? Because they are deliberately evading the capital controls. Not that we care particularly. The extent to which these people do or don't know, or probably should reasonably suspect that the source of the funding is drugs, I don't think they care, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I imagine if you're under the constraints that you have there and you can park some money in a safe hold, you go on vacation, you probably never come back. I'm sure we'd give them citizenship for no real reason whatsoever, or one of our neighbors to the north or south would, and here we go.
Right. Well, when you live in communist China and Xi Jinping has a habit of disappearing millionaires and billionaires overnight, I do think that successful business people do live in fear of being snatched up in one of these random purges. So I can understand why they're looking for a safe haven to get the money out, to park it maybe under their kids or their extended family, buy some property in the U.S., that kind of stuff.
I mean, wouldn't the way to track that, I mean, obviously there's got to be some sort of change in control in that bank account if all of a sudden new people have access. And so, is that not the way to monitor that from the Treasury standpoint, where you could actually see where this is likely happening? Or is it just so vast and so spread out and it's just too random to track?
I think there are tells that allow the Treasury, and the Treasury is actively working on this. And I've spoken with the new team under this administration, very good team, very strong team that is working for the president now. So they're on it. But I think really where you break the case wide open is when DEA gets in there and flips some of these money launderers, catches them at a stash house, at a cash house. Yeah. And you start to get inside the organization and you destroy it from the inside out. It's hard to do it from the outside in at the bank level.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess we've also seen, this administration is basically saying hostile foreign powers, China, Iran, Russia, have no business operating in our hemisphere. Right. That's the Monroe Doctrine, or maybe they call it the Donroe Doctrine these days. Can you talk about, the framework for Latin America and how it ties to our foreign policy in other parts of the world? Obviously everyone understands, hey, Venezuela, the reason Iran and China and Russia were into it was because of the oil. They didn't need the fishing, they didn't need the other things. It was always because of the oil. Talk about how that network is intertwined.
So, the Monroe Doctrine it's actually a fascinating little excursion, which I won't dwell on too much, but there basically have been two philosophical approaches to the Monroe Doctrine. When James Monroe actually posited the doctrine originally, it was an isolationist doctrine, right? Everybody focused on the fact that it said European powers, you stay out of our hemisphere. But the quid pro quo was a commitment for the United States to stay out of European affairs. So it was an effort to kind of create a sphere of influence to keep the Europeans out. And that persisted under John Quincy Adams and several subsequent presidents. But then Theodore Roosevelt came in and looked at it and took a very different interpretation. He had a corollary as well, and his corollary and President Trump's corollary are very similar. And basically, it's a much more assertive form of the doctrine that says we are going to actively project and protect our interests in the region, and we will not tolerate foreign powers coming in. So, for Theodore Roosevelt, those foreign powers were the Spanish and others. I mean, he actually sent warships to force the Colombians to give up the canal zone to us in the first place, and so on and so forth. Ronald Reagan continued the application of that same doctrine, and President Trump's approach has been the same, but the adversaries are now different, right? So it's no longer the Europeans we worry about. It is, as you mentioned, the Russians and the Chinese. And I will tell you, they were in Venezuela full bore.
Yeah, my understanding is, at least the accounts that I've read, that a lot of the, missile defense systems and the satellite systems that were there guarding against, Maduro's capture were actually, Russian and Chinese. I mean, what made it more impressive, you're not just taking on a banana republic, you're taking on, maybe a banana republic that's really well funded and really well armed by, some of the finest technology allegedly anywhere in the world. I guess it didn't stand up to ours in this case, but that's a big deal. And I guess the other part of that I'd ask you, I didn't, I always think of the Monroe Doctrine as a little bit, more controlling. I didn't realize it was sort of, hey, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Why is it so controversial that we would continue to exercise this in our own hemisphere, but it wasn't controversial that our greatest adversaries were clearly doing exactly that for the last few decades?
Well, because the leftists that whine about the assertion of U.S. Might are going to complain no matter what. You also had, in the case of Venezuela, the removal of Maduro, I can't stress the importance of that. And it's very, very similar. There's so many parallels to what the president's now doing in Iran. So when you look at the Middle East with Iran, the Ayatollah and all of his fanatics, they are really at the root of all of the instability, the violence, the terrorism, and the disruption across the Middle East. Exactly the same case in Latin America. The Venezuelan regime was fomenting Bolivarian socialism and communism all over Latin America, using oil revenue to underwrite these regimes, whether you're talking about Lula in Brazil or AMLO in Mexico or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua or in Cuba, for instance. It was the Venezuelans propping those left-wing movements up. Now that Maduro is gone and Delcy is under the thumb, that revenue stream has dried up. And unlike the leftists who complain about an assertive Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, the Latin American communities across almost universally welcome this new approach because they know it means an end to the corruption, an end to the autocracy, and a restoration of the rule of law and democracy.
So what is happening in those, obviously you knew Venezuela was, feeding a lot of these criminals to the United States. They were clearly, financing a lot of the drug trafficking that was coming here. But, I didn't really think that much about them funding some of the other sort of, let's call it, communist socialist regimes of Latin America. You mentioned a few of them. How did that work? Was that a big political play to keep leftists in power? You obviously, you see the conflicts in Brazil between, the current government and the prior and arresting their political opponents. You've seen the same in some of the other countries you mentioned. I didn't realize that funding even, I was thinking of going north and causing trouble and getting rid of their bad people and creating, problems in America, but it was also going south, maintaining those other unstable and unhealthy regimes.
Absolutely. And the number of different sort of contrivances that they would use varied country by country. In the case of Nicaragua, it was a corruption scheme involving PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company that was shipping oil to Nicaragua, but then Ortega and his family were skimming the revenues there and then taking that money to, an example, taking that money to basically buy up all of the media, the free media in the country, to silence it. The Venezuelans themselves did the same thing. This guy, Raul Garin, was used in a currency manipulation scheme, generated millions, and then bought and silenced the main television station, Globovision, which was very critical of the Chavez and Maduro regimes. And so that kind of play, strangling democracy through the destruction of free media, was a pretty standard MO for the way they would use this money.
Yeah, I've heard similar from even in Mexico, that happening where they're skimming, the Mexican state owned gas facilities, skimming the oil, selling it on their own, and then basically just using it to go buy votes for the parties in power. I'm sure some of that money's getting in their pockets, but it's literally like, we're going to skim off this. I don't remember what it was, but there was a pretty successful Mexican businessman. It was like, oh yeah, it was billions of dollars just lost oil. It went from storage facility to its destination, and a big percentage was magically missing, and then everyone gets paid 30, $35 a vote, and they keep the other people in power.
Right. And, in the case of Cuba, so what the Cubans did for the Venezuelans was they provided the Praetorian Guard that surrounded Maduro because they didn't trust the Venezuelan army to protect him. Of course, that elite Cuban force was what got shredded by Delta when they went in and captured him.
That was a vision. So, you see him carrying the boxes back out to Cuba.
Right.
Because you think of, listen, I don't think of Cuba as sophisticated a regime, and they don't have the natural resources to necessarily back it up. So it was curious to see that, I got, China, Russia, Iran maybe being involved, but, Cuba, how did that happen? Because I think of Venezuela as probably a more sophisticated dictatorship, not because of any real level of sophistication, but because they actually had the potential capital based on, their oil reserves or, rare earth minerals or whatever it may be to actually fund, whatever their activities were.
Cuba is an artifact of the Cold War, right? And so they were the beachhead for the Soviets. And so the Soviets had a massive signals intelligence station on Cuba. Now the Chinese have it. But the Soviets trained up Cuban intelligence, and Cuban intelligence is actually one of the most dangerous and formidable intelligence services in the world. Obviously not on par with what we can do as demonstrated, but what they were doing was they were furnishing that Praetorian Guard. They were also providing some cyber, SIGINT, counterintelligence capabilities to the regime. And in exchange, they were getting free oil. And so now what you see with just in the past couple of days, the protests in Havana with the brownouts, the blackouts, because Cuba's not getting that free oil anymore. So the old Soviet communist proxy, which helped spawn some of these movements across the region, they're on the ropes. Yeah. And the president's made clear that regime's days are numbered, and Marco Rubio's rumored to be in discussions with them about kind of the inevitability of all this. Mm-hmm. So I do think that the Dunroe doctrine is in full effect, and I think this administration is only getting started. I did want to point you to one very, very dangerous thing that the Maduro regime, which by the way included Delcy Rodriguez, who is still there, her brother Jorge. One of the things that they were doing is there's an indictment of a guy named El Zabayar. And El Zabayar is indicted because he was sent by Maduro and Diosdado Caballo, who's the interior minister, the repression police guy. He was sent to the Middle East to basically trade cocaine for Hezbollah weapons and Hezbollah fighters and Hamas fighters. And he was instructed by Caballo, and this is all in a New York indictment of El Zabayar. But Caballo basically told him, go out there, recruit these people, bring them back, and we're going to set up training camps inside Venezuela to go conduct attacks against U.S. interests. And so what we saw during the Maduro regime was we saw just a landslide of passports issued to Middle Easterners, people who couldn't even speak Spanish. They imported Hezbollah and Hamas, and they set them up in training camps all over this place called Margarita Island, and multiple different Hezbollah camps on that island. Wow. So they were there, they still are there, and the Venezuelan regime was deliberately importing this Middle Eastern terrorist threat to attack us.
So it seems like the new leaders are seemingly working pretty well with America. I think they understand what can happen. I mean, what do we do about mitigating that threat and eliminating it entirely? Because if that's still active, that would be shocking to me if we know about it and nothing's been done.
Well, we know about it for sure, and we've known about it for years. Years ago, I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense of War, but Defense at the time for Special Operations, and we knew that there was a passport-related operation on Margarita Island. But it's gotten so much worse, and they are still there. The good news is with an embassy, with restoration of diplomatic relations, we now have a footprint on the ground where we can gather additional information to be much more pinpoint precise. But this is something that the regime is going to have to be forced to deal with. It'll be difficult for as long as Diosdado is around. Obviously, he's got a $25 million bounty on him for the narcotics trafficking into the U.S. Delcy does not currently have any reward money offered for her, though she is sanctioned by the Treasury for being a massive human rights abuser. But I think the strategy is working. She is compliant, and they are making progress. They've seen really the expulsion of a lot of the Russian and Chinese operators, the Cuban operators. So progress is definitely happening on the ground without massive social unrest and violence.
Yeah, I mean, Maduro got taken down in January after the administration went from sanctions to actually striking drug boats and seizing tankers. You've sanctioned members of his regime at Treasury, and then we saw Biden basically do the opposite. Where do we stand now in terms of all of that?
So I think one of the cases you're referring to is this guy named Alex Saab. So Alex Saab he's at the heart of this plot because he was Maduro's bagman. So Alex Saab is a Colombian, as we're now discovering, so is Maduro, in violation of the Venezuelan constitution. But Alex Saab was put in charge of a number of money laundering schemes, and he's been indicted in the U.S. for some of those. And we got him. Eventually, we got him. I was after him personally because I found one of the most horrific schemes was this thing called the CLAP program. So Maduro would not let despite the fact he destroyed the country and people were starving, he would not let humanitarian assistance come in to provide food aid to the Venezuelan people. Why? Because he controlled the distribution of food boxes. That's what these CLAP boxes are, is food boxes. He used it as an instrument of domestic control. So if you were a good little Venezuelan and you voted for the Chavista party, you got your CLAP box. You didn't vote for us, and they could tell by the fatherland cards they would distribute, no food for you. But what Alex Saab was doing was he basically got a sole source contract for this CLAP program, and then he proceeded to inflate the prices and to basically package up subhuman, substandard foodstuffs, weevils in the flour, these infant formula that was basically Chinese plastics, all this kind of just stuff not fit for human consumption. And he was making money hand over fist for Maduro doing that. And so using hunger as a weapon, I found that most particularly offensive. But once we started working against Saab, he got more and more important with the regime to the point that he was so influential that Maduro put him in charge of brokering weapons deals with the Iranians. And that's when we finally got him in Cape Verde. He was en route to Iran to do a major weapons deal when they snagged him. We got him. It took quite a while. The Cape Verdeans were under enormous pressure from the Russians, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, the Lebanese to let him go. They stood firm and they extradited him to us. And then Biden turns around and lets the guy go.
Are you serious?
Yeah. He traded him for, do you remember the whole thing with Fat Leonard, the corrupt admiral or the corrupt guy who was doing all the Navy contracts?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Fat Leonard was under house arrest. He's dying from cancer. So he did a runner and went to Venezuela. They grabbed him, and Joe Biden issued a pardon and traded Alex Saab for Fat Leonard. Regardless of the fact that it's a bad trade, and your father never had to trade for any hostage release. Joe Biden was all about, remember he gave up Victor Boot for Brittany
the
Griner?
Merchant of Death for Brittany Griner. I mean, doesn't seem like a great trade. I mean, I imagine that guy's peddling death again, but
yeah, he's right back in it. He was caught or identified as brokering weapons to the Houthis. Well, Alex Saab got released under a Biden pardon and went right back to it again. But recently, Delcy has arrested him. And they are now in the process of negotiating extradition to the United States. I think he's coming back to the U.S. to face additional charges, and that is going to be of monumental importance because this guy, Alex Saab, he knows where Maduro's money is. And
yeah, I mean, so I know there's sort of billions in seized assets from Maduro and perhaps his inner circle. I guess this is one way to get to that. And then what do you ultimately think is the end use of that money? Once it's seized.
Several end uses. We're talking, I mean, it almost defies human comprehension how much money was stolen by the Maduro regime. We're talking probably $300 billion over the past couple decades. And that money is all over the place. Some of it is frozen in the US. A lot of it is in Europe. Some of it's in Russia. Some of it in Dubai and other places. Um, there are a couple of things. First and foremost, uh, that money should be made available to American families who have been victimized and terrorized by the regime under lawsuits here domestically, under anti-terrorism related lawsuits. So that money is targetable by those families. It's also targetable by American companies that were expropriated unlawfully, who lost their business operations because the socialists just came in and took everything. And then finally, that money needs to be returned to help rebuild Venezuela, I should say. I mean, that money belongs to the Venezuelan people. It was stolen from the Venezuelan people. And the price tag of getting Venezuela back up on its feet is very large. It's not insurmountable because Venezuela has these massive oil reserves. They have massive gold reserves. Their human capital is still among the best in Latin America. So this country can rebound pretty quickly, but finding that money and coming up with a mechanism to bring it back to Venezuela is going to be it will take years, and it'll have to be a sustained effort.
Yeah, and I like to your point. I think unlike a lot of other regimes in that part of the world, they do have the natural resources. I mean, it can be done right. I mean, this can go back to being a success story. And Venezuela was certainly the richest per capita nation in Latin America, if not the sort of Western Hemisphere, for years. Hopefully that can be the case again.
It will be. I know a lot of the Venezuelan people, the Venezuelan opposition. I know you've talked repeatedly to Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize winner, and others. And this is a very, very smart, talented people. So there's no question in my mind that they will rebound. I think that we just have to recognize that the president and Marco Rubio have a strategy, and it's working. And that strategy is executing ultimately towards free and fair elections, which haven't been held. But when those elections happen, and they should happen, I couldn't put a timeline on it, but they'll happen during this Trump administration. And I think you will see the Venezuelan people themselves go down the path of restoring democracy. And this will all be accomplished without boots on the ground by the United States.
Obviously, that's a really big deal.
Yeah.
At Treasury, you screen foreign investments for national security threats through CFIUS. Again, China's been pouring money into Latin America for years: ports, telecom, mining. If you were still, in that chair, what are some of the other things that you'd be flagging, and do we even have the tools to counter it? When these deals are technically outside of the United States and its jurisdiction.
We do, and there's a number of things that should be done that were terminated under Biden. I'll give you a couple examples. So I spent a lot of time in Panama working on those problems. And one of the things that I told the Panamanians is you're losing control of the canal to the Chinese, and this has got to stop. And so I actually had Treasury translate a kind of a slimmed down version of our CFIUS law into Spanish. And then we formatted it in kind of the way the Panamanians do presidential directives. And I gave it to the Panamanians and said, you need to issue this. You need to create a screening process because you're being eaten alive by the Chinese and you don't even know it. They didn't do anything with it. In fact, the president on the way out awarded a slew of new contracts under highly dubious circumstances to the Chinese.
Like a briefcase of cash?
Yeah. And so, we need as a nation, and the Treasury together with the Justice Department needs to be pushing these countries to create their own CFIUS type processes to scrutinize foreign purchases of critical infrastructure. And I think that would go a long way. Another thing that happened under the Biden administration was they basically clawed back all of the Treasury, not all, but many of the Treasury attaches overseas. And I've been talking with the current team. I strongly feel that we need to put more attaches out there because these are experienced financial warriors who, sit at the embassy. This isn't something a State Department person knows how to do. It isn't something that a CIA guy or a DEA guy knows how to do. It's a unique skill set. But when you put these Treasury people into these high-risk jurisdictions, And then you also send maybe some DOJ folks to help train. Prosecuting money laundering is one of the hardest things to do, and that's why a lot of people don't want to do it. But sending retired tax judges who've seen tax evasion, which is basically money laundering, sending them out to help train local friendly prosecutors is another key thing I think that needs to be done hand in glove. And it's consistent again with the president's agenda of not needing to use force, but using all manner of other national instruments of power.
Marshall, that's incredible stuff. I realize that a lot of people may not understand what CFIUS even is. Can you give us the quick, 30 seconds on CFIUS, what it means, what it's intended to do? Just because we're talking acronyms that they may not fully understand if they're not kind of watching this stuff every day.
Right. Apologies. Yeah. So that stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. And that is a law. I forget when it was actually enacted, but over the past couple of years and then significantly expanded in the first Trump administration. What it does is it basically requires foreign investors who want to buy something that we in the U.S. government feel is of vital importance to us, critical in some way. They have to provide paperwork that shows who they are, where did they get their money, and what are they planning to do with this purchase, with this acquisition. This law came into being because we discovered we were just being gobbled up by the communist Chinese.
Yeah.
I remember in the Bush administration that they were buying huge plots of land next to naval air stations.
Yeah.
Right? Because they were going to put up quote unquote windmills, which are basically, self-powered collection platforms next to our naval bases. And we just didn't even know it. They had shell companies to buy the property and all this stuff. They were buying into our defense companies. So if they couldn't hack it from the outside and steal the intellectual property, they just buy it outright, or they do a combination of both. So that's why this law came into being. And that's why the Treasury administers that process. And so, I didn't run the process at Treasury, but I had the Treasury, quote unquote, vote. And I looked for basically three things. One is DOD good with this? Has DOD signed off? Department of War. Two, where'd you get your money? Where is all this money coming from? And three, have you or your company, whoever you are, whether you're Chinese or you're French, have you been doing business with bad guys that we've sanctioned? Yeah. And so, they needed to successfully pass those questions in order and others from other departments and agencies in order to get a green light to make the buy.
Interesting. What role today does perhaps the AI or other technology play into combating illicit criminal syndicates, and are American banks cooperating with these efforts?
They are, but I would say we're behind the curve. We really need to be an early adopter of using AI in terms of penetrating these opaque shell company webs. It's very doable, but right now the process is really manual and therefore very slow. But as we've seen in the case of these Somali daycare clinics in Minnesota, or now we're seeing the latest in Los Angeles with cancer treatment. These structures are not terribly cleverly set up. They just roll in, they get an office building, and then they mint out 15 companies located at one little premise. These are detectable things that AI will greatly help with, and I think we need to jump on it.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like for a lot of that, it shouldn't even take AI to actually discover it. I mean, the Minnesota stuff is absolutely insane. The stuff that I've seen about hospice care in California, 85 different hospice centers in one building with one address.
Right.
I'm like,
right.
It's sort of hard to believe that our systems, even before AI, don't flag these sorts of things. And it sort of feels like that's because, the beneficiaries are incentivized to not have that happen. In this case, I think a lot of this is kicked back to the Democrat Party. These are big voters of theirs. They're donating to their campaigns. There's a reason they're outraising us 5-1, even in Republican seats. How much complicity do you think there is, on behalf of the government officials. And, I imagine it's happening everywhere, but I would think that these blue states are probably far worse because it seems to be their MO.
It's absolutely their MO, and I think they are complicit because they benefit politically from the patronage system that gets set up around this massive amount of corruption. What's worse, though, for instance, the case of the Somalis, is that a lot of that stuff was going in duffel bags on planes through the UAE back ultimately to Somalia, where Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda terrorist organization that has killed Americans, takes a cut. So this was financing terrorism at its root level, not just funding Democrat campaigns and Ilhan Omar's, pocketbook. Yeah. So we need to clamp down. But these departments and agencies, the IRS, FinCEN, they're operating with antiquated IT systems that just haven't been modernized to handle big data and to make best use of it. I think that's something that Doge was getting at, and I think we have to keep on it. I remember we did a particular thing involving bank accounts across multiple New York banks that we believed might be related to North Korea, and the banks dumped wasn't huge quantity of data by Department of War standards, but for FinCEN it was a massive amount of data, and they just couldn't pound their way through it. So I ultimately had to negotiate an MOU with the Air Force to get them to mine the data to show us the network that was sitting behind all these various different bank accounts. And we discovered all kinds of stuff going on that we had no idea.
Wow. I mean, if you could give one piece of advice to the current administration, what would it be?
I'd keep doing what you're doing. It's working. I mean, it really, I'm just over the moon on where things are headed with Venezuela. We tried our level best in the first administration to get rid of Maduro. Now he's gone. The campaign plan against the mullahs in Iran is working. And again, we're going to see this regime so thoroughly weakened, again, without having to put boots on the ground, that there will be a massive decline in terrorism across the Middle East. I mean, the Iranians they've killed thousands of Americans over the years, starting 47 years ago when they took our embassy employees hostage. And so I shed no tears over the elimination of the supreme leader. I'm rooting for his kid to go the same route. And I think we have to keep the pressure on. We're making good progress.
Well, Marshall, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Really insightful. Scary how sophisticated these networks have become. This isn't your everyday criminals, even in places that you think of sort of banana republic-y. They have figured out how to work the systems in a probably more sophisticated way than many people who do that in a legitimate way for a living.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, Scott Bessent and his team, they're on it.
Yeah.
And
Scott's been a rock star.
They are. And his assistant secretary, the guy who has my old job, is phenomenal too, Jonathan Burke. Great guy.
Awesome. Well, Marshall, thanks again. Really appreciate you being here. And guys, hope you enjoyed that one.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Hit that notification button so you never miss an episode. Head over to Apple and to Spotify if you miss us here on Rumble. If your friends get their podcast that way, download the Rumble app. Again, like, share, subscribe. Get it out there. Without you, it doesn't happen. We need to break through the walls. We need to break through the algorithms. You guys are a part of it, so hit the like button, share it with a bunch of your friends, and also check out our amazing sponsors down below and in the video description. They keep the lights on here. They help us get this information out there along with you guys. So share, your goodwill with those who support your values. So stay strong, stay informed, stay engaged, and always stay a little bit triggered. Thanks again, guys. I'll talk to you all again soon.